everyone, it's Kelvin, and once again I'm back at you with another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. So in today's video I'm going to show you how to paint this Volkswagen bus illustration, and I think this will be a really fun video because not only is this the first time I think I've painted a vehicle on this channel, it's also an illustration that has a kind of a unique quality because we can reuse the bus again and again, the same bus, and just have a different variety of backgrounds. So I've already got a watercolor paper texture loaded into Procreate, and for this one I'm using the St. Petersburg paper texture. Now for the brushes, I'm going to do pretty much all of this with the regular watercolor brush kit, but at the end when I do the pine trees I will use the Alpine forest brush kit, but that's totally optional. And as usual, I'll put links to all the brushes, textures, and materials I used in the description below. And as you can see, I've already got my sketch sort of loaded in here, and you guys can have this one for free. I'll put a download link in the description. Now I've just placed it in here as the very top layer, just up here, and I set the transparency mode to multiply, and that's because I don't want it to cover up what we're going to paint, because from now on we're going to be painting on a blank layer underneath the paper texture, just like you normally would. I'm going to start by painting the colored part of the body of the bus, and I'm going to do that with a kind of a red color, but you could use any color that you wanted. And for the brush, I'm going to use the abstract round brush, which is part of the regular watercolor brush kit. Now at a pretty large size, I'm just going to roughly fill out the colored part. It doesn't matter if I go beyond the sketch here because I can cut it back with the eraser tool later on. Now after that first pass, I recommend going over it again, and you'll see it gets a little bit darker on the second pass. And that's okay, it's just going to make this otherwise smooth bus look a little bit more interesting. And if you want to, you can grab the water blender brush and just kind of break up some of those hard edges, but I'm going to try to leave a couple of them behind. Now as you can see, I've gone beyond the edge of the sketch, and that's okay. I'm going to fix that later on. For now, I'm going to move on and do all the windows. And just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to do these on the same layer that I did this colored portion. And I'm just going to use the abstract round brush, and then a pretty light gray color, and I'll just fill those in real quick. Next, I'm going to grab the eraser brush, and I've set that to the fine liner pen brush, and maybe around 10%. I'm just going to go around and sort of cut back wherever I went beyond the sketch. And I don't want to get too carried away with making it perfect because this is a pretty loose illustration, but I'll try to kind of cut back the major mistakes that I made. Next, I want to make the body of the bus a little bit more interesting, and this is optional, kind of depending on the style that you're trying to go for, but what I like to do is use the selection tool set to freehand, and because I painted this all at once it looks too uniform, so I'm going to use the freehand selection tool and just select the door panel, just like this. I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten it a little bit, maybe even shift the hue a tiny bit. And I'm going to do the same thing on the front panel, just to make it look a little bit different so it stands off a little bit. Now I also recommend giving the body of the bus here a random color variation, and I'm going to do that with the selection tool set to freehand. And I'll just make a selection like this. I'll feather it out quite a bit. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness for the layer, and I'll just shift the hue a little bit more towards magenta, and maybe I'll just lower the saturation a little bit. And that just drops in a kind of secondary tone that makes that otherwise smooth red look a little more interesting. Now I still have the same gray selected that I did the windows with, so on the same layer I'm also going to add a shadow down here on both of the wheel wells. So what I'll do is I'll grab the abstract round brush, and then at a pretty small size I'll just carefully go in there and fill this space in. Otherwise it does look a little bit weird if I just leave it white. So this is looking really good, and until now I've been using just this one layer. Now for the wheels, I'm going to do those on a different layer. So I'll make a new layer above everything, and I'm just going to do those in black and then a few different shades of gray. And for the brush, I think I can do it all with the fine liner pen. I might use the abstract round a little bit, but mostly I'm just using this one. And maybe just to finish up the wheels to make them look a little bit shiny, I'll use a very light color, almost white, and I'll just add a highlight towards the front. Next, I'm going to move on and add a couple of shadows. And because I've got a lot of white in the body of this bus, I'm actually going to do the shadows by painting them on a separate layer. So I'm going to make a new layer above everything. And I'll select a sort of medium gray color, very, very desaturated. Then using the abstract round brush, maybe around 20 or 25%, I'll just rough in a couple of random shadows. And they're going to look too dark, but it's okay because I'll lighten this layer later on. I'm just using it this dark because it's easier for me to see where I'm painting. So that looks pretty good. I think I've got all the shadows where I want them. Now I did all those shadows on this separate layer, so I'm going to set that layer to multiply. Then I'm going to lower the transparency to 0, and I'll just slowly raise it back up just until I can barely see it. I know it might not show up on camera, but for my eyes here, it looks like a very, very light gray color. Now this is coming along really good, and just to keep the layers a little bit more organized, I'll just go ahead and merge the 3 layers I've done so far just onto one. And I'll make a new layer above that, and now I'm going to move on and do some of the outline details. I think it's going to be easier to do those if I lighten the sketch. So I'll lower the opacity, maybe around 10%, just so I can barely see it. And then on this separate layer, I'm going to use a pretty dark color, almost black, I guess. And for the brush, I'll use the fine liner pen, and maybe around 10%, 9 or 10%. I'm just going to follow all the lines on the sketch here, and basically give this a dark black outline. And next, just like I did with the shadows we did earlier, I'm going to set this layer to multiply. I'll lower it to 0, and I'll just raise it back up just until I can barely see those lines, but they're not too overstated. I think in this case around 20% is pretty good. Next, I'm actually going to do another layer of outlines, but this time I'm going to do it much more sparingly. So I'll make a new layer above everything. I'll use the same dark color and the same fine liner pen set to 10%. And I'll just add a black line wherever I think it needs a little bit more help with the contrast. So there we go, that turned out really nicely. Now after that, I'm going to move on and do the shadow on the bottom of the bus. So I'll make a new layer for that, but I'm going to drag it all the way to the bottom below the body of the bus. And I'm going to use a pretty dark gray color. I'll use the abstract round, maybe a medium size, and I'll just rough that out. And after that, I'll just grab the water blender brush, and just big enough so that it kind of fits in there, I'll just mix up the hard edges like this and just make it a little bit softer. So now at this point, the bus is pretty much done, and just to keep the layers simple, I'll once again kind of merge them all together. And now I can move on and do the background. Now the background could be anything that you wanted. I even considered a palm tree background and maybe adding some surfboards to the top of the bus. But just to keep this video simple, I'll do a simple pine tree background using the Alpine forest brush kit. And that's a separate brush kit, and as I said before, I'll link it in the description, but it's mostly brushes suitable for painting pine trees. So for that, I'll make a new layer, and it's above the bus. And I'm going to go ahead and grab the Alpine forest brush kit. And I'll start with the fine abstract pine brush. I'll grab a kind of dark greenish yellow color, I think something like that. And I'll start by just doing a small line of pine trees like this. Next, I'm going to go to my adjustments, and I'm going to go to Gaussian blur for the layer, and I'll just click and slide to apply a Gaussian blur. And I did those really rough and loose because I'm going to blur them out anyways like this. I think something like that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to lower the transparency of that layer, maybe just around 30 or 40%. Now I'm going to do the next layer of pine trees, and these are going to be the larger foreground pine trees. So I'll make a new layer for those. Same green color, but maybe a little bit darker. I think I'll use the same fine abstract pine brush, maybe a larger size like that. And I'll just quickly rough those in. And after that, I'm going to grab the Misty Water Blender at the bottom here. This one here, kind of a medium size. And I'll just blend up the bottom just to make it look a little bit kind of cloudy. And after that, I'll merge the two layers that I did the trees on just onto one layer. And they're basically covering up the bus. So I'm going to use the eraser brush set to the fine liner pen. And at a really large size, I'll just roughly cut out basically a place for the bus to fit into the trees. But I'm going to avoid the edge of the bus just because I've got a really large brush size selected. And after that first rough pass, I'll go over it again at a really small size on that eraser brush and just make sure the trees end exactly at the top of the bus. And there we go, this one is all done, and here's what it looks like when I print it out. I think the bold, simple color of this illustration is sort of important. So for example, in this one we just have the green for the trees and then the red for the body of the bus. But if you want to make it more interesting and kind of break up those big bold shapes, I recommend giving the salted watercolor brush kit a try. Here's what it looks like when I use that. And it does have, its own style that's not suitable for everyone, but I think in some cases it does look really interesting and it might be suitable for your project. And if you're interested to learn more about the salted watercolor brush kit, I'll put a link to that one in the description below as well. And that pretty much wraps it up, but as always, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.